I don't know if I'm cool enough to do TikTok. Technically, we have a TikTok.
I am definitely not.
I don't know how to do it, and I need to find someone younger than me who.
We sound so old right now when we say that. No. I'm not talking to you. It's like anytime I say, I'm just like, what happened? Yes. What happened to me? Where I can go, I don't want to deal with that.
Yes.
Anyway,
we were on the forefront of this thing, and now we're
exactly. Now
asking
we're like
our kids how to use the phone.
So, I'm not going that far, buddy. Welcome back to the Ministry Without Hating It podcast, a ministry of Odyssey Haven coaching and counseling dedicated to the pursuit of answering the question, is it possible to do ministry without hating it? We have a theory that it just might be. Brenton.
Yes.
We somehow, some way, we did it. We did it. Yeah. We're at the end of a third season.
We're here and we made it.
This has been a really great season for me. I don't want to speak for you. I'll let you do that here in just a second. But I think of we have always had great quality guests. But this run especially, I feel like has been speaking to me exactly where I'm at as we do these episodes. And, I think the joke between you and I is we do this as a resource for others, but really it's for us and they get to come along for the ride. How do you feel?
I call it free counseling.
Yes.
Like, most people pay for this kind of help, and here we are. We get to sit in it and ask the same questions right back.
Right.
And I think we couch it in saying asking for a friend. But
asking for a friend. Yes. Which comes up again in this episode, of course. And I like that you actually, that's a beautiful segue. You said free counseling because we got to sit down with a legit therapist, counselor. I mean, I know that can be, but he's a therapist. He's a licensed therapist, and walk us through his journey. Today, our season finale, our guest is BrianJames McMahon. But he and I have got to spend some time together even recently, and been trying to bring somebody on with his experience for a bit, and we'll see where that goes here. I don't want to be too much of a spoiler alert for this episode. But just in sharing his journey of where he's at now, the things that he has learned, but then also the ways that he walks with other ministry leaders specifically in that, it's just really, really good. I'm really, really excited and can't wait for people to hear this episode. I think there's going to be a lot that people walk away with in their own journeys. And I mean, how do you feel about that?
I agree.
You agree?
Yeah.
In fact, I want to point out now, before they get into the actual interview, this is probably the quietest we've ever had Brenton.
Oh, no.
And that's not because we didn't let him speak. It's just that, as he likes to say, he was really, really absorbing a lot of this, right? It was really hitting home. No, it was, it's a good one to just sit with. And at a couple points we do as well. And so I think we've talked enough probably about this. I think it's just time to get into it. And before we do, though, I do want to say thank you. Some that are listening have been with us since the very beginning, and you send in emails and texts, and you're just very encouraging. And we just want to say thank you for that. Mm-hmm. That means so much to us. And those that have just recently picked it up, thank you for also supporting us and even passing this along. Our hope still is to see this grow into something that really resonates and is really a gigantic help to those who are in the trenches of ministry right now. And so we see you, we love you, and we thank you. And so without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with BrianJames McMahon. Well, it is our pleasure to welcome BrianJames McMahon. Thank you for being on the Ministry Without Hating It podcast.
It has been a minute making this happen, and I'm glad to be here.
Yes, it has. And I don't know if you know this, but you are actually our season 3 finale. Did you know that?
Oh, I did not know that. I don't know whether to be excited about that or like you're trying to hide me at the back end of the season.
we'll see where this goes, and then we'll, that'll
we'll let you know at the end.
That'll help us determine. That's no, I think it's going to be great. It's somewhat strategic, believe it or not, actually. So,
yeah,
there you go. You can bear that weight as we go through this. You're welcome. All right, we'd like to. You were going to say something. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Chad, I really am grateful to be able to spend time with you on a podcast, in other conversations. I just appreciate who you are, the work that you do, the questions that you ask, and the conversation that emerges.
Wow. All right. Well, that's the end of the episode, everybody. Thank you for being here. And now we'll just jump in. We like to start off a bit of an icebreaker, but also help people get to know you, asking questions that have nothing to do with ministry, but sometimes end up going there anyways. And so I'm doing this at the top because your website does it too. To some, it looks like you've got 2 names, but there's more to it than that.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes I say that I just try to live a life that is as confusing to people as possible, partially because confusion, when done in a grounded way, brings curiosity and exploration, deepens relationships. So that's kind of my tongue-in-cheek answer. But ultimately, James is technically my middle name. And I spent most of my life really disliking my name. Brian is, to me, and no offense to other Brians out there, to me, and this is probably one of the most Enneagram 4 things that could be said.
Oh,
Brian
nice.
felt boring. It felt flat. It felt uncreative. There was no color. There was no music. You can't do anything with it. You can't shrink it, expand it. And so I didn't like my name and always wanted a nickname and tried, but then ran into the dilemma that when you give yourself a nickname, it creates a really awkward moment when people ask you where the nickname came from. And so I realized I can't do that. So I just succumbed to being Brian for a while. And then when I got into early adulthood, I realized that if I hold my first name and my middle name together, there was a expansiveness in that. It felt like me. It felt creative and roomy, and that there was space for the internal world of vibrancy that I live in to find its way into the external space. You guys hear the Enneagram 4 in this, right?
No, this is great. I love it.
Yeah. So that's the story. So Brian James, some people call me Brian, some people call me Mr. James. It is so confusing, but I do go by Brian James with the last name McMahon. And that's the background of that story.
So Brian, okay. So, and actually for my clarification, because I've seen it both ways, is it all like when you, like, even I'm looking at your name right now, it's all together, or do you put the space between it?
So legally there is a space because James is my middle name. Functionally, I take the space out because I'm trying to cue people in to actually, I prefer to go by Brian James.
Okay.
I won't like punch someone in the face for calling me Brian, but the preference is Brian James.
Preference is Brian James. All right. Do you hear that for the rest of the interview?
Noted.
No BJ, no Beige.
No,
right?
No,
we're not doing that.
No, you just get a lot of dead air.
We got enough of that anyway.
We do. I do want to say, I know of at least one Brian that listens pretty frequently to this, and we just want to say we love you. We love you.
Oh, and seriously, no denigration to any other Brians. This is more of my own idiosyncrasies and the bizarreness of trying to match my internal world to my external expression. That is a particular thing to me.
That's good. Well, okay. Well, then with that, describe yourself in 3 words.
You sent me this question ahead of time. You're like, we might ask you this. And I sat with this and I have like 3 different lists of 3 different words. Because it was so hard. How do I just go by Brian? Give me 3 words. Right. It's like, go by Brian. I'm like, but I got multiples. So a couple of the options that I have. Okay. One is when I talk about what I do, and how I function in the world and how I move through the world, I say there are 3 words. One is see. The second one is meaning, and the third one is unlock. And I talk about what I do, the work that I do, how I move through the world is I see people and help people see themselves. I help make meaning of the experiences, and I help unlock people, unlock experiences, unlock gifts and talents, unlock confused moments. And so really those 3 words describe what I do, how I exist in the world. I think when I take it a little bit more behind the scenes on that, I think the words that I would use would be hope, lament, and bravery. That when I think about the notes that my soul plays, I think there is something that holds on to an ever-present hope that there is something so much bigger and more beautiful and more complicated that is accessible to us, but we have to find it. And so there's this hope that says, oh, there is more. Paired with that is there's a constant lament that says the reality that we're living in is not the reality that we're designed for. And there's an incongruence and an imbalance that needs to be acknowledged and noted and lamented and felt. And so there's this hope that mixes with lament that is engaged in this ongoing journey of bravery that says if we're going to live in the lament and hold on to the hope, that's going to require a pretty brave life. And those are three words that I've been cultivating and living into and growing into, but I think they describe the behind the scenes of the see, make meaning, and unlock.
Wow. So that was just the first question, everybody. Can you see why we were excited to have this guy on here? That's really good. I have a silly question that's next, but I actually want to bypass that for a second because I think this lends to this other one. And this is one that I have been sitting on, to be honest. It's like the right person or the right guest to ask this, because I don't think it's for everyone, but I think based on what you've just said and even how you described yourself, as an Enneagram 4 and all the fun things, is the question of why do you feel like we create art?
I think art exists to be the portal to the beyond.
Okay.
That good,
when you say beyond,
the good art takes us somewhere beyond the art.
Okay.
Right. Whether that's into our own imaginations, whether that's into deeper places of relationship, whether that's back into our moments of history, whether that's into new imaginations of the kingdom of God, that the power of art, like to sit in a song and allow a song to carry us somewhere into the depths of our feelings. Sometimes it's taking us beyond, which is like an external place. Sometimes the beyond is this deep internal place that evokes experiences and thoughts and memories. But the beauty of art is actually where it takes us to, not even in just what it holds itself. So I think we create art because there's something in each of us that knows that the literal concrete reality we live in is not the totality of life in the world, in the kingdom of God. And there's something in art that actually keeps our attention to there being more depth, more pain, more suffering, more beauty, more hope, more life, that there's an expansiveness to life that is not captured in art in a limiting way, but is accessed through art as a portal to the beyond. So I think that's why we create art.
That's really well said. And actually, when I think of especially the song that you mentioned, like, I have playlists just for specific feelings. Okay, full disclosure, I think I've told you this before. I'm an Enneagram 6, but there are times I question that because I so relate sometimes to the 4 side of things. Not that I like to be in my feelings, but you know what I mean. It's just like, I wonder if there's
I wonder what it would be like to sit in my feelings and not panic.
Yeah. No, I think you just nailed it. So I'm definitely not a 4. So there we go. That was awesome. Well said. All right. Silly question and then I bypassed. Which 2 companies would you like to be sponsored by right now?
That's a really hard question for me. I think probably a fancy shoe company. Not like a sneaker, but like a fancy dress shoe company that I could get really nice leather, wood-soled shoes that are just always on point, and I could just have a whole closet full of real classy shoes. Because when that question to me is going, what are the companies I want free stuff from? That's how I think that question. I don't know if that was the origination. So probably
it can be.
Probably a fancy shoe company. Maybe a company like Patagonia. I think they got some really great stuff that I think would be great to have. Or I also
a sponsor.
Yeah.
By the way, none of these care about our podcast. So keep going.
Yes. Or I wouldn't mind being sponsored by Subaru and getting to drive around new cars all the time.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I could handle those.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I think you answered that right. Because I mean, when I think of it, it's like, Nike, because I'm a sneakerhead, and that sounds right.
Yes.
Just give me all the drops. Yeah.
Or a bookstore that would just send me all the books that I want. That would be right. Whether it's Barnes and Nobles and be like, hey, we just want you to sample all the books. And so I just get to fill my shelves with books that I read parts of, but don't complete, because I get excited about an idea and then set it down and then go find a new idea and a new book. So I have like partially completed books that just fill my bookshelf.
Huh. Wow. This is so illuminating. I feel like we found out so much about you just in these, who says that these are silly questions? Listen, so Lindsay, I'm not putting her on, on blast here, but she oftentimes will skip over this. She's like, this is not the meat of the, I'm like, but actually it's starting to become that. It's, it's really interesting. So anyway, as we segue, what are you finding exciting, or what are you looking forward to right now, especially as we're ending a new season, new year, heading into a new one? What are you finding exciting right now?
I am really excited about the stage of parenting. So I have a 4 and a 5-year-old at home who, for right now, it is awesome. They play together, which means that I don't always have to be involved, and my wife and I can actually get a little bit of time. But the imagination is there; the conversations are emerging. It is really delightful right now. And then we have an older spiritual daughter who's about to have a baby, and so we're kind of becoming quasi grandparents in a new way. So we're just in this season that is exciting from a family perspective and a lot of fun. And I think also coincides with a settling that has been taking place in myself over the year of growing in contentment, of being settled and of being rooted and of being in a place with a people, that I think those two things kind of happening simultaneously has just brought me to a spot where I'm really looking forward to this season as a family. Other things too, but at its core, man, my kids are a ton of fun right now. Yeah.
That is a fun age. Yeah. Yeah, and I think we've talked about this with other guests. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just different, and then you find new things within it. And so we're entering into the teenage years, and all the dynamics, Brenton, right, that we've talked about with that come forward. But there's a lot that I love about this that I did not have at that age as well. And so, good for you to be present in it. That's so important. That's so important.
Thank you.
That's good. I want to shift a little bit, and here is some of the strategery behind having you specifically, and a lot of your story, which we want to hear about. And obviously, it's more than that. But for a very long time, Brent and I have talked about, we have this podcast, Ministry Without Hating It. Wouldn't it be interesting to talk to somebody who has stepped out of maybe what would look like traditional ministry in some setting, but also doesn't look back on it with some sort of disdain? And as I've gotten to know you, you certainly fit that. And normally within this space, we would ask our guests about their ministry story. And I want to do it just a little bit different if we can. I think that'll resonate with the four in you. That we'll do this just a little bit different, because you have stepped out of more of a traditional, and was it vocational for you? Ministry?
Yeah, we pastored church, we church planted. Yeah.
Okay. And so you stepped out of that a while ago, and into a different kind of ministry, which we'll talk about more on that. And so that said, what did ministry look like for you prior to your current season? You just talked a little bit about that, but expand that for us.
So my wife and I like to say we tried to do as many of the different ministry expressions in as small amount of time as we could. And so in a window of 10 years, we youth pastored. I stepped out of ministry for a while because there was a point in time where God made it clear I was really gifted and talented at ministry, but I sucked at life and wasn't a good husband and a good man. And so my wife kept youth pastoring, and I drove a delivery truck and got into therapy and sorted and began to pay attention to the darkness in my own soul and find life from that. And then came back out of that and stepped into serving alongside my wife. And she took over a church that we pastored together. Functionally, we look back on that and say now that we did hospice care for a church for a couple of years, that it was a church where the relational culture had really atrophied, and there wasn't financial relational equity present in the community to extend the on-ramp long enough to revitalize the community. And so we just walked it to the end. And that was a pretty brutal, painful experience for everybody involved. And for my wife in particular as the lead pastor in that community. And we came out of that and we planted a house church as an intentional healing community. Say, how do we actually deep dive into relationship in a way? Wrestling with the questions, can the church actually participate with the healing of deep wounds? Because we had come through many moments where we were observing churches causing harm and deep wounds two leaders and two practitioners and say, what does it look like to actually say, if our singular focus is healing, what does that look like? How do we do that? Ran some experience. It actually was an incredible time in those couple years where we pastored that church before relocating to Kansas City about 5.5 years ago. And at the time, the framework of moving to Kansas City was still the church plant. Was to come and we moved in the city. We started that. And it was really during COVID that really reoriented some of our attentiveness at the tail end of pastoring the church and then church planting. I had gone back to school to become a therapist. And so there was kind of an on-ramping of that expression of me that was coinciding for a while with pastoring. And it was during COVID that some clarity was given in terms of most useful expressions of the gifts that God has placed in us and where our contribution actually sits and what spaces and doors are open for us. So that's kind of a snapshot overview of our journey in ministry. But it was traditional. It was paid vocational ministry for a number of years. That was the framework, I think, for a long time. That was what I thought the track that I was going to be on. I think I had some imagination that someday down the line I'd be pastoring a mega church, and I kind of have some of those charismatic tendencies within myself. And now I am very grateful that God engaged differently, reordered my life, and am able to do the things now that I'm able to do, that I think I'm better for it. I think the people around me are better for it. I think there would have been a lot of damage done if I had kept going in some of the trajectories that I was on.
So talk to us a little bit about that trajectory, because I liked that you said that, God he engaged me differently. Yeah. So what does that mean? What were the things that you noticed, the things that began to shape in you through all of that to get you to go, maybe this is something different for me?
Yeah. Well, part of my story is I grew up overseas on the mission field. And so there was a lot of isolation that came as a part of that. And one of the things that one of the places of pain that was placed within me early on is questioning how much I matter. And there was a way that longing to matter got connected to the longing to be seen, which when woven into platformed positions and stage presence, creates a form of mattering and a form of being seen that doesn't necessarily actually bring healing to the place within that longs to be known and seen and matter in a really deep, internal, private way. And the way that particular kind of pain pairs with platform and stage in a way that scratches the itch but never actually heals the wound would have set me up to continue bigger platform, bigger stage, bigger spotlight, being seen by more people, mattering to more people. And so much of that was unconscious, right? I didn't get into ministry thinking, hey, I'm going to get on a platform so that people love me, so that it'll heal my wound. Yeah. But actually, I love preaching. I love doing ministry. I love so many of those things. I have talents and gifts that lend themselves really well to those spaces. There was just the internal unconscious that was continued to draw me into that place. And that was when I mentioned that season of ministry where God sat me down, and it really was drawing attention to saying, there are some things here that you're trying to build for yourself that aren't yours to build for yourself. And you're trying to meet some needs in ways that they're not meant to be met. And we need a correct course. And so as God pulled me out of ministry and I went on this long journey, it gave me permission to begin asking the question, is that context the right context for me? What other options are there? What is within me? And what is the pain narrative that is within me, but also what is the giftings and calling that are within me? How have those been entangled with each other? How do I pull those apart? And when I start to pull them apart, what emerges now that maybe wasn't there before? And so that was a kind of, when I talk about God altering my course, those were a big part of it. And then the other piece that came into that was over the years of vocational church-centric ministry, of congregational care, I couldn't stop noticing the way that people would meet Jesus and the way that their lives would be shifted. And then they would come into community with other humans and be wounded and hurt and walk away from Jesus because of the woundings that were experienced from humans. And I kept noticing how much the church struggled to talk about it. how much the church struggled to know what to do with that. It was almost like when our attention is on the resurrection, we know what to do. We know how to speak, we know how to move, we know how to hold faith. But when we're standing at the foot of the cross, where death is present, where harm is present, where dreams have been shattered and broken, we actually kind of panic and don't know what to do and have a way of trying to rush people to the resurrection that overlooks pain and suffering. And so what also during this whole journey, part of what began, the questions I began asking were the questions around what do we do with pain and suffering when it shows up in our community? Because we certainly don't seem to be doing a very good job at it. And the hope that I have is a church that actually can participate in healing. The lament that I have is that we have a church that often participates in harm. And we sit in this stuck spot and we don't know what to do. And this is where that bravery piece kicks in. We're going to have to be churches that are brave and people that are brave. So that really shifted what I was seeing and what I was looking at, and began to cause me to ask some questions about whether or not platform stage, pastoring our congregation was the right context and the fit. So I went back to school to be a therapist because I wanted to learn some new frameworks around pain and suffering and healing, and how do we think about that and what do we do, and thinking maybe I would hold these two together for a long time. And so I spent a few years kind of in that in between. I'm kind of both. I'm kind of neither before the kind of final shift out of vocational ministry.
Wow. It's really interesting. I'm hearing you tell that story, and I resonate and hear a lot of that. And oftentimes the narrative that you hear with other leaders that go through the same thing, in some regards, deconstructing what you've always known, right? And even why I do what I do. And I do think that it's healthy to do that. But oftentimes it goes in a negative direction where I don't hear an ounce of I'm rejecting all of that in you right now, but it's can we embrace this in a different way? I say that because I'm really curious, asking for a friend maybe, right? But like, how were you able to guard your heart to a space of like, no, I'm not going to just hit the eject button and y'all can just figure it out. I'm going to go do this. You know what I mean? Because that oftentimes is the story with even some close friends of mine who are not in ministry anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a couple of things that happened. One, I think in the conversations that my wife and I had about really what are we after? And I think paying attention to what the longing is. And this is why when I talk about hope and lament and actually the need for both of them, that so often when pain shows up, we lose sight of the thing that we've hoped for and get sucked into. And there's an appropriate season of entering into places of loss and grief, right? That when the disciples were looking at Jesus being killed, theoretically, they had been told the resurrection will be on the other side. But in that moment, when they haven't yet experienced resurrection, they just sat in the loss. So I think there's a period of time where actually we do need to experience what it's like for hope to disappear. That's not a bad place. And I remind people all the time that when the sun goes down at night, it's actually dark. We don't panic because we know that the sun will come up tomorrow. But if I'm sitting with someone who's been blind their whole life, and now their sight comes back and they've never actually experienced a sunset, what they've known is darkness, which was they can't see. And then the sun sets on that first night, and they go from being able to see to now things being dark again. That makes sense that they would freak out and be terrified and feel like they are returning to the totality of darkness. So it would be unkind for me to say, hey, don't freak out. Don't freak out. The sun's going to come up tomorrow. No, what is kind is for me to sit and go, I know that the sun will come up tomorrow. So I just need to ride this out with you until you too discover that the sun comes up tomorrow. And what actually happens is we lean and we beat people up for experience the darkness of night that we actually don't need to fear because the sun will always rise. So to say I never lost hope would not be fair, because there certainly was a season of going, do I actually want to identify myself as a Christian? Do I believe in church as a structure and as a construct? What happens if I put everything up on the table and say goodbye to all of it, and allowing myself to go into those places of imagination and allow it? And what I found was that as I did that, where I sat at the foot of the cross at the death of the imagination and the constructs and the beliefs that I thought that I had, and I just sat there and I grieved. And I grieved that the things that I believed might not come to fruition. And I grieved that the imaginations I had might not be lived into. What I found was what I was left with was the deep longing and the hope of a world that would experience a God who never disappears. In Psalm 139, there's a verse in Psalm 139. Then in one of the translations, it says that, the passage is the chapter on where can I go from your presence? If I go to the heights of the heavens, you're there. If I go to the depths of Sheol, you're there. And there's one verse that says, for even the darkness is not dark to you.
Oh, yeah.
That has been a line in the Psalm that I've held near and dear to my heart, because it isn't that God just always comes in and turns on the lights. It actually is we have a God who can sit in the darkness and can still see. And what does it look like for us to be people who learn to see how God sees, not just when the lights are on, but for whom the darkness isn't actually dark? It doesn't mean we turn on the lights. It doesn't mean we rid the dark. We don't have to fear it. We don't have to be scared. The sun always comes up. The light is always there. It will always win. But to be people who actually can sit in the dark. So it opened up this question about, what if we don't be so scared of the dark? And what if we don't be so scared of death? What do we then do? How do we engage? And that created some room for a hopeful imagination that says, I don't need to destroy. I'm just asking some different questions. So that piece was significant. And then there was a moment where my wife and I were sitting on House of the Hill in LA, Foursquare's kind of retreat center.
Oh, yes.
And
Very familiar.
We were wrestling with, are we being rebellious? Are we trying to take a flamethrower to the church? Are we we don't think we're trying to destroy things? Because we had left the structure of congregation church building. We're doing house church. And it was during an era of time where there was a lot of people starting house church because they were anti-organized church and church structure. And so we're doing these things saying, I don't think we're doing this because we're anti that. I think we're doing this because we're trying to wrestle with some questions that we can't wrestle in that context. And we need a different context to wrestle with these questions. And so we're sitting there at House of the Hill wrestling, and we got to spend some time with Larry Spousta, who I imagine, Chad, at least who he has maybe spent some time with, and he's been just so kind and elder in our lives. And we're wrestling and saying, are we being rebellious? And he smiled and he looked at it. He goes, you guys aren't rebels, you're renegades. That you're just people who just kind of operate on the fringe, asking some different questions, calling some accountability. You're not against society, but also you can't fully buy into just the way that things have been. In that framework of renegade versus rebel really gave my wife and I some permission to set aside shame and guilt and fear of going, are we trying to destroy things? Going, no, we're not. Yeah. We're just asking some questions because we believe that there are some things that are available, that are possible, that we can find, that maybe some of our contexts actually make it even harder to ask the questions and even harder to find some of the answers that we're looking to find. So I think a mentoring, eldering voice that reassured, that said, you guys are okay. Like the questions you're asking aren't wrong, aren't bad. I know you're not out to destroy, allowed us to settle in to say, okay, we're not out to destroy things. Because this is maybe just a me thing, that the reason I can't be an anarchist in any context, whether it's related to church or politics, is I have zero belief that I could create a system that would cause less harm than the system we have.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to say I'm going to destroy something that exists, I better believe that I can create something better. And I just don't know. I think any organizational structure has flaws and is going to cause harm. So I think that created a little bit of a buffer for me to go, I'm not here to destroy. I think we need to widen. I think we need to widen our imagination to become more inclusive of ways of experiencing God, of ways of being community, of ways of making disciples, that it isn't to limit or to restrict, but to welcome and to expand and to invite new imagination.
Yeah. Well said. That's good. And you know what? I love that. Actually is even helpful for me in a lot of ways. Just the framing of renegade versus rebel, because you're right. I can even think of we're we all belong to the same movement. And I don't always agree with that or even like the direction that things go, but I'm also not here to see it all just collapse on itself either. And so, it actually does give good insight that I'm not trying to be rebellious, but I am trying to, like you said, reframe, ask different questions. I love the phrase of widening, of how that looks and what that means. That's really good. I almost need a moment to sit with that. Go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah. I was going to say that's all comes from a place of hope, that we hope people meet Jesus. We hope that we see him in whatever context we're in. And yeah.
And I'm
how can we join in and do that together? Yeah.
When I think we'll talk more about this as the interview goes, but I think lament is an intrinsic, inherent, and essential component to protecting and holding on to hope, because there's a false hope that we can get caught up in, which is actually really what we're talking about is we have a fantasy. That is different than having a deep hope that actually something could exist that we do not yet see. Because that's what the sitting in the hope is. And we'll try to fantasize and we'll try to dream and we'll imagine, we'll call that hope. But actually hope requires honesty about our current context so that there can be things that emerge from that. And if we can't hold room for the lament of the honesty of what is, I'm not actually sure that the hope we're holding is honest and real and true.
Yeah. I have found a new appreciation even recently, but just for sure over, I think of any transition in my life, and I have not ever transitioned out of a traditional sense of ministry. It's looked different in different seasons, but that there is always a season of lament of what I, like you said, what I had hoped would be, or maybe fantasized, or, the vision that I thought was there, and, can that be repurposed, and understanding the reality of it, of no, I'm just in this space and it's not pleasant, but I'm not going to be here forever either. Yeah. And that's real important. You've talked already a little bit about some of the things that you had to walk through with that, and the roadblocks potentially, and the things that you had to, I just think you very vulnerably, and thank you for that, shared with us your journey in that. I'm curious, maybe for a second, speak to someone who might be considering their own stepping out of what they've always known. Maybe it's not even ministry. Maybe it's just the opposite of going into, I don't know, but what's the first thing you say, or maybe even, you like to ask questions. What do you ask them?
I usually start, I guess, let me say this first, that anything that we do in reaction to pain will continue to be reactionary to pain regardless of the outcome.
Oh, okay.
Things that we do that are oriented toward life and hope and value will be rooted in the orientation towards life and hope and value. So when I sit with someone who's beginning to explore a transition, where we actually start is going, what's the pain that's present, that's driving the imagination, the desire to make a change? And it isn't that the pain is bad and problematic. That actually pain usually is what alerts us to something is wrong, something is amiss, there needs to be a change. The difficulty is if we can't be honest about the pain and can't create room and time for pain to be healed, the new imagination actually will be rooted in pain. And as the roots go down deeper, they will go down deeper into our own places of unconscious pain and begin to draw into the life of the tree that grows from the roots of pain. And so it becomes really important to be able to be honest, to say, yeah, this is the pain, this is the disappointment, this is the frustration, this is how the system is causing harm to the people that I love, and therefore I'm opposed to the system. Yes, we wrestle with the honesty of all of that, but then in that place of lament, of saying, what is the hope that yet continues to exist even as you've held on to pain? Like, why not just give up altogether? What is the longing? What's the imagination of what could be that sits in the place of the heart? Not just, I don't want to parent like my parents did. Now I swing the pendulum and I'm parenting differently, but I'm still parenting in comparison to the harm that was caused. And what we end up then doing is still parenting out of pain. And then our kids go, I don't want to parent like my parents did. Yeah. And they swing over and they parent like our parents did. And we end up with these generational swings because we're trying to not be like someone else or do something different from what was done, which is a different question than what has God placed in you? What has God placed in me that needs life breathed onto it? How has God designed me as a husband? How has God designed me as a parent? How do I cultivate that? And it may mean that I need to step out of the frameworks and structures in order to develop that imagination. But I can't just swing the pendulum of going, I need to be opposite to this or different than this. Trying to be different keeps us tethered to the thing we're trying to be different from. Trying to repair, trying to do like so often, and I watch leaders do this and I watch parents do this, where the intent is growth in life, but we frame it in a comparison that keeps us tethered to the thing causing us harm. And what we don't have the freedom to enter into is actually to put it all on the table and then to sit back and say, Jesus, who am I? What are the gifts you've placed in me? What's the dreams you've given me? And now begin to move me forward in this. Yes, pain exists. Yes, these things. Yes, there's going to be these patterns that continue to find their way in. But if I'm doing something in response to the pain, it will be rooted in the pain. And the first part of the journey is always to get really honest with that, to be able to find some healing, to find a little bit of distinction from that so that the decision we're making aren't rooted in that reaction to the pain.
Wow. You're like reading my mail a little bit on a few different. Well, it's I've shared this before. So we're recording this right before Thanksgiving. This will come out in December. We just had a recording though a few weeks ago, and we're talking about some of the unhealthy reasons we got into church planting with certain things. It's kind of like what you're talking about. No, I'm going to be the one that does it differently, or I'm not going to be this kind of a thing. And I love that of being able to go, what's the pain point, right? That I need to invite Jesus into and actually unravel the things that have been really bound up.
Right. Well, and this is even part of our own journey, because I think on the front end, when we closed down the traditional structure of church and started a house church, there was an element of going, I don't know that the things that we believe can ever happen in a traditional structured church, that it actually is the system that's causing harm. And let's create a different system where we can explore these things. So there was that element, because in some ways it's unavoidable to say, I'm going to take a new step and it's going to have nothing to do with my pain. That's probably just not very honest. And in that, being attentive to say, we don't want to build something that's rooted in pain. We might need to start something that creates an experimental space so we can wrestle and pull some things apart. But what we discovered was actually, small or large, we as humans and we as the church, in whatever context, tend to wrestle with deep, authentic, honest relationships that bring healing. That there are unhealthy house churches just as there are unhealthy, big, traditional structured churches. That's right. As we began to pay attention to saying what actually matters to us, what's the heartbeat, what's the core, what's the longing, what's the hope, what we kept coming back to is what we want is brave people cultivating relationships where there's room to grow and heal and become fully alive. And then we got to begin to say, okay, what are elements of smaller contexts that lend themselves to that? What are elements of larger contexts that lend themselves to that? Are there components of these things? But now we can actually draw from a variety of things without being structured and locked into going, oh, but that old way didn't work, so we're going to do this new way. And actually going, it's not about the way, it's not about the structure. It's about whether or not the things in us have room to be expressed and to nourish. And actually, we need to be creative and probably adapt in an ongoing way, because at some point you form a deep relationship and then you got to recreate something and disrupt something so that you can continue to grow in that way. So the pain is going to be inherent, but if we're not honest about it, it will actually it will begin to influence the formation of the new culture.
So you mentioned, and obviously there are, this is a nuanced thing, and there are different contexts that are unique to everybody. You start getting into backgrounds, life of the leader, all of the things, right? But so speaking from a place of pain then, and maybe as you're walking with somebody, or maybe somebody who's listening that's currently considering that kind of a transition, all right, I get it, I don't want to be part of the pain. What are some maybe healthy reasons for moving on or moving forward versus maybe, you've expanded pain, but that can be a litany of other things that are, branch out, as you said, from that, what are some of the things that you would lean into for people of like, hey, maybe this is time, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're in an environment that's causing you harm, that is valid reason enough to say,
right.
I need to step out, that I'm just never going to be a proponent of staying in a context in which we experience ongoing harm. And there's all sorts of reasons why we're experiencing it that way. And it's sometimes because the environment and the context is harmful. Sometimes it's because our own narratives don't match how we experience that context. So there's a variety of reasons. But I just want to be clear that like, being harmed, being hurt, experiences chronic pain is reason enough to say I need to do something different. So that's valid. But I also think even more than just that framework, I think being attentive to saying, why is the hurt being experienced? Because there's a lot of different reasons being in an environment would feel painful. Sometimes it's because I'm being stabbed in an ongoing way. Sometimes it's because there is a constriction that happens of going, I don't have permission, freedom to express things that God has put in me that need room. And so what I'm doing is I'm actually just like compressing and holding and retaining and shrinking. And that actually is causing me pain. That is another form of pain that goes, okay, I need some place where there's room for me to be me. That's a valid reason to begin exploring other things. And sometimes we're being asked to walk in ways that don't feel congruent to us. Like there was a season of my life when I was learning to do hard things where I decided I was going to run a marathon. And so I started training and I ran a marathon. And one of the things that was fascinating to me was as I became stronger and as I trained, I discovered that my body actually had a pretty natural, like when I'm strong and healthy and in rhythm, this is the pace that actually just feels natural to me. That in everyone's natural pace when strong is going to be a little bit different. And so what I found was I can run with a lot of people, but the runs I loved the most were running with people with whom their natural pace was real close to my pace. There was just a freedom in that. So I think that there are times that we find ourselves in communities that just run at a different pace. And sometimes we can villainize that. We can blame them. Like, you need to get stronger and you need to learn how to run faster, or you need to slow down and not leave people behind. And I think there are places that we really get off track and we do need to be attentive. And sometimes we do need to slow down because there are people who want to grow into this with us. And sometimes we need to speed up. But having some room to be able to attend to, like, what's my natural pace? And do I need a place where I can run at that way? I think as we've shifted out of traditional ministry into what I'm doing now, I think that's a piece that I've just been loving, is going, I can actually just run in a way that feels intuitive and natural to me. And there are moments where I would change that pace because there are some people I want to run with for a while. And that matters. And sometimes I'll work harder to keep up, and sometimes I'll slow down because I really want to involve other people. But to also give myself permission to go, there's just a natural cadence to this expression, to this way of being, where I feel aligned with who God has made me to be and my function in the world. And so that's a big piece. When people are looking at transition, I'm walking with pastors or other people as they're exploring transition. We're talking about what's your pain, but we're also saying, how aware are we of what our actual inherent cadence and pace and rhythm of life is? And what does it look like to lean toward that? Does your current context allow room for that? Does it not? And how do we begin to examine that? But that becomes a movement towards something, not just away from something.
Yeah. I love that. That's good. Well, and thank you too for, really unpacking the way the different, still going back to that word pain, the house of pain, right? Is that the name of the episode? Probably not. But that's still, it's really funny. I was just finishing up my message for this weekend coming up. And there was a point of talking about the pain point and how we want to stuff that. We want to move away from that. We want to avoid it for sure. When, like you said, it can actually be a good thing that motivates and moves us or makes us aware of that which should not be, right? And how, especially speaking to the transition, whatever that looks like, it may start from a pain point.
At its core, pain simply means that something is off. Right? Something is misaligned, something is incongruent, something is other than what it was supposed to be. So often we think pain equals bad. sometimes pain does equal bad.
Right.
But sometimes pain just means my back is misaligned and I just need to go to the chiropractor and be readjusted. And now I'm not in pain. So pain expresses in many ways, which is also why I go like, we need to get over our fear of pain and our aversion to pain, because actually pain is really useful as an access point into beyond. And this is why the work that we do now with Church Wilco has so much to do with pain. And I have some friends who like to tease me, and they call me the pain guy, because I just want to talk about pain and suffering and sit in that and sit in hard places and be the Enneagram 4 that just wallows in those places. And what I have to keep reminding people of is that a big part of the reason that I have such a dislike of the existence of pain is pain covers and masks and hides the image of God that is inherent in people. And when we turn away from pain because we're scared of it, because we don't know what to do with it, because we get overwhelmed by it, because someone else's pain hits on our pain, and we turn away from that pain, we're actually turning away from the image of God in someone. And the invitation for us is actually to lean into pain with this lament that says this is terrible and not what God intended, but also with the conviction and the hope that there is more in this. If we can be attentive and we can be present long enough and we can sit together long enough, what actually emerges is the image of God.
Okay, so it's really interesting, because I was actually just thinking, so going back to your 3 words, one of them was bravery.
Yes.
And in particular, when we're talking about acknowledging the pain, maybe speak to, and I won't beleaguer this anymore with the transitions, but like the bravery piece within that, especially with the pain of, okay, now I got to take that next step.
Yeah. So I've spent the last 10 years really working around concepts of safety. When I think as we started our house church was really the conversation, how do we cultivate safety in community? And I think that's a really important framework. And I'm grateful that in our society, there's more concepts that like emotional and relational safety are things that we need to be attentive to. But one of the things I started to notice as I worked in the concepts, in the experiences of safety, is we're starting to create culturally this bifurcation between safe and unsafe. And we have this idea that places and people they need to be safe, or these are unsafe, toxic people that are to be avoided. And so we're looking for safe friendships, cutting off unsafe friendships. We're looking for safe churches. We're avoiding unsafe churches. And actually at its core, when we sit with constructs around safety, what we find is that safety is co-created and cultivated. That safety is not inherently present or absent. It is always in the process of being built or being destroyed. And because safety is progressive, that we're becoming safer, right? I don't know that any of us are ever like fully, completely safe. I don't know that any relationship is established safety in a way that will never be at risk of being damaged and destroyed. There's always inherent risk. That actually pursuing safety and pursuing being safe churches and safe places actually is a false target and not helpful, because at the end of the day, when my bravery is met by your bravery and the bravery is acknowledged together, we become safer. That there's this process that you taking risks with me. In Church Wilco, we talk a lot about the relational tables. And actually, you guys have a table of truth in your community. And we talk about like putting things on the table. And actually, when I have the bravery to take a risk, to put something on the table, and you meet me there, and your bravery meets me, and you join me, and you receive what I put on the table, and you put something on the table, and you're brave and I'm brave, and we see each other in that bravery, we actually settle more deeply into safety in the relationship, because trust begins to grow. So the pursuit of safety actually will get us offline, because we'll just be cutting off places that aren't safe. The cultivation of bravery actually moves us all towards safety, but it's risky, because safety only emerges if we're both brave together. If I'm brave and you're not brave, we don't get safer. I just get beat up.
Wow. Oh, that's good. That's good. All right. You've talked about this. You've talked about this a bit as far as like where you're at now, what you're doing. And so this is actually a great segue, as you talked about. You brought up Church Wilco. What does the word, and we finally come to the actual like question that we usually start with, but I think it's great that we've got here, because I think it's going to help us move to where we're going next with that. And that, what does the word ministry mean to you now today?
So I think about like the Greek word that's used in scripture, and I'm not a Greek scholar, so I don't even know if I say it right, but it's like diakonoia or something like that.
It's all Greek phrase. To me. But, sounds great,
right? Yep. But there's a part of that is sometimes translated as humble servant, but another expression of that Greek word is actually the go-between. And when I think of ministry, and particularly from me, so I don't necessarily want to put this as a definition that everyone who would identify in ministry would take on for themselves. But for me, that framework of being a go-between has been really, really significant. I think part of that growing up, I say I live between worlds. So I grew up in Southeast Asia, but I wasn't Chinese. And I come back to the States, but I didn't grow up here. So I'm not really fully from here. And I'm kind of live in this in-between space. And I've just noticed over the years of actually how many of us live in these in-between spaces. Like we're Christians, but we don't fully fit within the context that we're in. Like we're Americans, but we don't fully fit within the context. And actually there's just like, I don't fully fit in places. And we all need some people who live in this in-between space. There's room to be in the in-between. And there's actually room to go between people and to go between cultures and to go between places. And we live in this now but not yet kingdom. And we're kind of always in this in-between of going between expressions of the kingdom and expressions of the fracturedness of our world and people who know God and people who don't know God. And there's this movement in between. And so for me, when I think about ministry, I think about the movement between hope and lament, the movement between who people are and who God has shaped them to be and says that they already are and who they're growing into, places of brokenness and pain and avoidance and places of hope. And to me, to be a minister is to be someone who's always moving in between, who becomes in some ways a go-between for people, who said, like, I'll hold hope for you when you can't hold hope for yourself. And I'll just stand in this in between. And I don't need you to even believe the sun will come up tomorrow. I'll just hold that on your behalf. Will be this go-between. So for me, that idea of going between has really been significant to me to how I think about what it means to minister and what ministry looks like.
I really, really like that definition, the going between. I really, really like that. I wonder if you could pull out then how has that, because you've mentioned Church Wilco, you are now a licensed therapist. And so how has that definition then, how does that work in with maybe even some of the origin story of what you have been able to create as a ministry, but also as a means of, it's a vocation, as well?
Yeah. So I have a therapy practice here in Kansas City, BrianJames Therapy, which also lends itself to people thinking James is my last name. That's fine. That is what it is. And my focus of practice is with clergy and organizational leaders, and my team works with a lot of other people, but I specialize in working with pastors and organizational leaders. And that was a spot that I landed on, of just recognizing that I want to really take seriously about the invitation to sit deeply in the pain and the darkness with people. And I want to learn how to do that. And I found that as I learned how to do that, I did that pretty well. And it became a gift to a lot of people. And so for a while, I just kind of shifted to say, let me just be a therapist. And I think there was also an element of God's journey in my own life where God kind of asked me, can you actually just go do work that no one knows about, that you're not allowed to talk about, like legally not allowed to talk about what you do? Can you go live and do work in anonymity and settle into the fact that you still matter and you still have value and you're still seen? And that settling into that role of a therapist for me was like this deep, full, existential, I'm leaving behind church. I'm walking away from having a voice in the church, because I grew up in churches where the only voices in the church were the voice of the pastor. And if you weren't a pastor, you don't get to speak into anything. So when I stepped away and I went through this time of surrender, saying, okay, I'm not going to be pastor, I'm just going to be a therapist, I'm going to go live in the shadows, going to live in anonymity, going to do this. There was an element of just kind of settling in. And then as I started working with more pastors, what I just kept running into was how many were telling the same story. How many were sitting in wrestlings of loneliness, of carrying the burdens of their people and not having anyone carry theirs. And this framework of like, I'm supposed to be strong enough to be able to do this. We're supposed to survive. And I was listening to these stories and I started finding myself going, can I put my clients together? Can they be friends with each other? Because I think I can't do that. I'm not going to introduce like that. There's ethical, legal ramifications in my profession around that. Mm-hmm. But what it began to open my imagination to was the need, if I'm taking seriously that part of the healing journey is communal, and part of the kingdom of God is expressed in the body of Christ, not just in a singular part of the body, then I need to be thinking about how we actually form context for that communal experience to emerge. And so I began to imagine, okay, what does this look like outside of just individual therapy, where yes, that is useful in healing and walking through those things. So during COVID, I just ended up with a number of pastors I was talking to in a variety of contexts that kind of felt like they were bleeding out during COVID. And so I said, hey, let's do a thing. I started at the time, I called it a triage group, just because I had pastors that felt like they were bleeding out. Let's triage this. And so the framework was, what does it look like for us to get together and practice confession and repentance and lament? Like confession and lament, what does that look like? And in the scripture that we oriented around was James 5:16 that says, confess your sins one to another and pray for each other that you will be healed. And the significance for that was this recognition that we confess to Jesus for forgiveness and we confess to Jesus for salvation. But if we want healing, it actually invites a human participant in the confession process. And I was sitting with pastors who are saved and forgiven, but they're not healed. And part of that is they were practicing confession with God, but not having context to practice confession with one another to bring the pain that we're holding in the places. And so we're actually sitting in places of unhealed pain, because healing of the pain in our humanity requires the presence of other humans with us. And so we oriented around that. And then we oriented around lament, sitting with Galatians 6:2 that says, carry one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Mm-hmm. And the number of pastors who were like, yes, I carry the burdens of my people. People don't carry mine. I've just had to learn to be stronger. And I'll say, like, you are welcome to carry your own. Like, if that works for you, do it. But also hold in mind that Paul says the law of Christ is fulfilled when we carry one another's burdens. So by you carrying your own, you're actually inhibiting the law of Christ from being fulfilled. So if that's what you want to do, if that works for you, go for it, but also hold in mind what scripture would say about the mutuality that is invited by all of us. And so we created a context where we said, okay, let's come together. Let's learn to be brave with one another so that we can form some deeper relationships. Let's talk about the risk. To me, if we're going to create spaces of bravery, we also have to develop the capacity to honor the risks that are being taken by those that are being brave, to be able to acknowledge bravery. Like, there's very little worse relationally than me being brave and you brushing that off like it's nothing. Like, I just took a risk with you to share something of myself, and you're just going to like brush that off like, then I'm not going to be brave with you again. But if I'm brave with you and I take a risk and you go, oh, you didn't have to share that with me. Like, actually, I hadn't yet earned the right to have access to that part of you, to hear that part of your story, and you entrusted that to me. Thank you. Now I'm acknowledging the bravery you took in this open space for all of us. So I started getting some pastors together. We would just meet once a month and we would confess and we would lament. And I pulled apart lament. And I do this a lot with Church Wilco. We make a distinction between lament and grief. And we talk about grief being how we mourn things that we've lost, but lament being how we mourn things that were, that never should have been, or were supposed to be, but weren't. That when the first time, right, a core family in your church that you've been leaning on, the first time they just make a change and say, I no longer want to be a part of this community, I'm out. The first time that happens, we grieve that. Yeah. The 10th and 12th and 15th time that happens, we're not grieving that, we're actually lamenting that we are experiencing community in a way that is not how it's supposed to be. And it's ongoing and it's progressive and it keeps going. And there's an injustice to that. And so much of the pain that we experience in ministry and in life actually doesn't sit under grief of things we've lost. It actually sits under lament of going, I'm living a life that is other than how I was designed to experience it. And it hurts. And there were things I'm supposed to get that I didn't get, and things I shouldn't have gotten that I got. And I'm just in this in an ongoing way. So we create these spaces. It started with these triage groups where we get 6 to 8 pastors together who share some commonalities, and we lament and we confess, we practice being brave, we deepen the relationships. And what's come out of that I've actually created Church Wilco as kind of the organization that serves as the umbrella for that, where we run dozens of groups for pastors now across the country, for senior pastors, assisting ministers, next gen, kind of getting some people in some shared spaces of leadership to practice these disciplines and these rhythms, to deepen their relationship with one another, to find places of healing, to learn how to be brave. Like the number of us who actually don't know how to do it, like theoretically, we have ideas, but when actually face to face in a moment, we go, okay, what's bravery supposed to feel like? What's it supposed to look like? How do I do it? So creating some places where we actually just get to practice that together has just become a really significant thing. So we run groups now. We continue to do some individual care around coaching, and we call it therapeutic pastoral guidance, which is kind of our spin on Christian counseling. And then we do a lot of trainings for churches that say, how do we cultivate bravery within our church? How do we think through places of relational disconnect? Which are these are all the things, going back to our season of planting a house church. These are all things that we say, okay, what does this look like in community? And we're experimenting and doing. And so I feel like the gift of God to me in this transition out of vocational ministry into running Church Wilco is I get to do all the things that I love. And I get to speak into the things that I love to speak into. In the structure of it looks nothing like I imagined the structure would be. But the heart is still the same. The lament is still the same. The hope is still the same. What drives and orients, but the structures look really different. And I needed to let go of some structures in order to create room for God to cultivate imagination for new ways of expressing what was in the heart to begin with.
Well, that's the bravery that you're talking about, that there is something on the other side of this, if I would just be willing to embrace whatever that looks like. To quote Gary Donahue, I want to double click on something there. And you talked about the groups, and you talked about the process. And maybe for someone who's like, oh, that sounds like something I'd be up for. Yeah. I am well familiar with your slow practices. In fact, that's something that we practice here. Essentially, I mean, full disclosure, Lindsay partners with you and works with you in a lot of ways. And so she's taken a lot of that, and we do that even as a staff. We walk through the slow process once a month. It's been fantastic. AJ, I'm going to let him just nod. He agreed with that. Tell us what that is. People don't know what slow is, what that process is.
Yeah, so it came out of the triage groups when we were practicing confession and lament. And actually that was part of what led me to create, I have the slow journal. It's available on Amazon. And for that, because I had some people saying, hey, we're practicing these things together. Can I continue to practice them on my own? I need a tool for that. So I was like, let's create the journal. And so the acronym SLOW is informed by restoration therapy is one of the therapeutic modalities that I'm trained in, that I think about, which has a lot to do with emotional regulation. And at its core, it really is the question, how do I transition from a place where I'm protecting myself to a place where I'm open to connection? And so it's this process of being guarded, hiding, withholding, withdrawing, to being open to taking risks and to being brave. And if we're going to be brave, we have to do that from a place of openness, not from a place of self-preservation. I use this phrase. I say that it's actually impossible to hug someone and protect yourself from them at the same time. Like you have to pick one. And so if we're going to embrace and we're going to go deeper in relationship and we're going to experience greater safety through bravery, I have to be able to transition from a place where I'm protecting myself to a place where I'm open to connection. And so restoration therapy really informs that. And so the slow practices themselves come out of these kind of 4 steps of restoration therapy, but I put some different language that draws us into the particular kinds of bravery that I wanted to cultivate and highlight with Church Wilco around lament and around confession. And so the acronym SLOW, there's a word and a question with each of the letters. And so the S stands for survey. And the question with survey really is this question, where am I? It's how we take an emotional pulse. It's the image that we'll do is if your life was a table, or there was a table that your life filled. What are all of the things that sit on your table? What are the relationships? What are the hopes, the dreams, the disappointments, the stresses, the to-do things, the people, the relationships, responsibilities? What is on your table? Let's just take a minute and notice what's here right now. Because every moment that we arrive in the context of our life. Our table doesn't disappear. Stuff doesn't get taken off. It's all there. We just don't always take time to notice. And so we start just with this question, like, where am I at? What's on my table? How full is it? How cluttered is it? How overwhelming is it? And then we move into the conversation of lament. And that's what L stands for, is this lament, to say, of the things on my table, what is disrupting me? What's causing me harm? What's hurting? So sometimes it hurts because like it's actually hitting on a wound. Sometimes it hurts just because it's a lot and it's heavy and I'm being crushed by how much I'm holding. Sometimes it hurts just because it's misaligned, that it's not even bad. It's just in the wrong place. What's causing the pain? Let me pay attention. Let me be honest to what are the things that I'm lamenting, things that aren't how I really believe I was designed for them to be, how God intended them to be. What's off? What's amiss? What's hurting? Is this question of lament. And then we move to this, the O, which stands for own, for ownership, which is the question, how are the things that I'm holding impacting how I'm living my life?
Yeah, but my favorite.
Right, because I'm glad. And it's actually the question that I find pastors have the hardest time actually attending to and being honest about. Like we want to believe that we can absorb pain and just keep going. But we know like when our bodies are in pain, our bodies move differently. Like when my knee aches, I limp. When someone punches me in the gut, my body is tense. When I'm nauseous, I'm not relaxed. And so that means that if I'm nauseous and my wife wants a hug, she doesn't get the same kind of hug she does when I'm feeling good and settled and my body is relaxed. When my leg is broken and in pain, I don't move with my kids the way that I would move if my leg wasn't in pain. So pain always alters how we function. And emotional pain is the same way, that it changes our tone of voice. It changes our body language. It changes how attentive or inattentive we are. It changes how present, how reactive, how irritable. And sometimes we just will go like, I'm just having a bad day. And we just don't notice, actually, I've been having a bad week and I've been unavailable to my kids. And instead of looking at them with delight, I'm looking at them with annoyance, and they're coming to think that they are annoying because they can't tell the difference between dad not having his stuff together and not being able to control his own emotions. And they're starting to feel responsible. Now they need to change how they behave to make sure that they don't annoy me. And this question of ownership is going, I need to be honest about the impact that these things are having me. Because I would tell you, the pastors that end up falling, burning out, flailing, doing dumb stuff, often are pastors who actually didn't practice ownership. They may have even attended to what's hurting in life, but they weren't paying attention to going, oh, actually, this is causing me to manipulate my situation. Oh, this is actually causing me to withhold information and to begin to hide. Oh, this is actually causing me to escape and to disappear and to avoid. And I'm not owning that this is actually what's happening in my life. And so we survey, we lament, we own. This becomes the practice of confession. When we bring this into community, is I'm not just lamenting the pain, I'm actually owning how it's impacting me so that others know. And when we survey and we lament and we own, it brings us to a spot where we can actually attend to where is God welcoming us, in the sense of what is God's invitation to me in this moment, right? I think about the moments in the Gospels where Jesus encounters people and he will ask them the question, what do you need me to do for you? Like what he starts with this question of like, what's actually hurting you, which is wild to me, because we know that Jesus was God and knows all things. And when you have a blind man like Bartimaeus that everyone calls blind Bartimaeus, it shows up. It's kind of an odd thing for Jesus to say, what do you want me to do for you? But there's this invitation to say, do you know where you are? Have you surveyed? Do you know what's hurting you? Have you lamented? Can you own the impact this is having on your life? And when we can do those things, now we enter into a moment where Jesus says, come here and let me heal you. Come here and let's walk forward. So sometimes the invitation is to confess. Sometimes the invitation is to go, oh, I need to go make some amends to some relationships that I've been causing harm because of what the lament and the ownership has exposed. Sometimes the welcome is actually just to sit and let God love on us. Sometimes the invitation is to lament some more and to give ourselves permission to be bummed out and disappointed, because that's a reality of our life. But as we survey and we lament and we own, it opens up room to say, where is God welcoming me? And even more when we do this in community, it opens up the question of, where is the community welcoming me into? What does it look like to be known and seen and held by the community that actually leans us into James, where as I am confessing my sins to my community and they are holding me and carrying one another's burdens, fulfilling the law of Christ, that actually my soul and my mind and my relationships begin to be healed, and I am welcomed more deeply into the fullness of the community of God that Jesus came to bring.
It's so, one of the things I love about this is it's so practical, and yet it's so simple. Just my lights go off just there. Isn't that fun? We have a motion sensor. Now I'm waving at, I've totally derailed the entire interview. That's just great. No, but like, and that is staying in, by the way. You can't finish the season without having something like that in there. Anyway, we love it because it's not simplistic, but it's simple and easy to practically apply and actually walk through.
Yes. And
man, the way you unpack that just now, I mean, that'll preach. Like, talking about being the go-between and just sitting there with people as they go through that. Because I love, Lindsay will ask when we get to the end, somebody has gone through the entire thing, they'll actually ask, would you like us to hear you, or would you like us to interact around that space? And, so far everyone's like, yeah, you can go ahead. But there's been days where I'm like, no, I'm good. Yeah, I think I'm fine. Yeah. And,
because if we're going to be brave, there are some moments where we're brave and we share, like we'll lament or we'll put an ownership on the table, and then we'll realize like, oh, like I feel so exposed right now. Please don't even breathe in my direction. Like, don't look at me. I just want, and actually it's an incredibly vulnerable thing just to be held. So there are some moments we always need to have permission to say, can you just hold me? Don't even respond. Don't flinch. Don't move. Just be here with me. That is about all I can handle because I was just brave. And actually for some of us, just sitting and not responding is actually our own act of bravery. To say, I'm going to choose to be present with you and not fix, not solve, not do anything, just to see. Because I will tell you, learning to see deeply requires a great deal of bravery.
Yeah, that's good. All right, BrianJames, this has been so good. And I'm so grateful for all that you have just given here. I feel like we could have taken this and unpacked it even more. And so maybe we'll do a spin-off podcast. We'll see, we'll send you the papers and everything, and we'll get it all figured out. But somebody who's listening to this says, I want that. Yes. How do they get connected to what you're doing, where you're at? I mean, we'll make links in the show notes, but.
So, I mean, the easiest way is just through the website. It's just churchwell.co. .co is the end, so churchwell.co, and it has all the information for all of the resources that we provide, the trainings that we're doing. We have a slew of trainings coming up across the country in 2025 that for people in different parts of the country, if they want to get connected to some of those trainings, love to have them be a part of that. But also for those maybe interested in joining a slow community or a pastoral care group, all of that information is there. We're on the socials, Facebook and Instagram primarily. I don't know if I'm cool enough to do TikTok. Technically, we have a TikTok.
I am definitely not.
I don't know how to do it, and I need to find someone younger than me who.
We sound so old right now when we say that. I've never. No, I'm not talking to you. I'm like, anytime I say, I'm just like, what happened? Yeah. What happened to me? Where I can go, I don't want to deal with that. Anyway,
we were on the forefront of this thing, and now we're.
Yeah, asking now
we're our kids how to use the phone.
I'm not going that far, buddy.
And I will just say to those that are listening, like what my heart is after is that we could help the church reimagine its relationship with pain and suffering, so that instead of turning away from it, we can lean into it, because as we lean into it, the image of God is revealed on the other side of pain and suffering. And we overlook that and we miss that when we become scared and intimidated. And so if there are ways that myself, that Church Wilco can help, whether that's doing trainings, we do them virtually, we do them on site, whether that's experiences with us in some of our groups, this just really matters to me, that we would actually be people who aren't afraid of the dark, but actually learn how to sit in it with one another, knowing that, man, if we sit here long enough, the night might feel like forever, but the night will pass and the morning will come and the sun will come up. And there's an invitation, I think, for us as the church to become people who can learn to sit with people in the nighttime. Well, we know the day will come where the sun rises, and that's when we get to celebrate. But for right now, we hold hope and we sit and lament and we practice being brave with one another.
That's awesome. I can't think of a better way to close out just this, not this episode, but even just this season. So BrianJames, thank you so much for everything you've shared. Blessings to you as you move forward into this new season. And thank you once again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to connect further with our guest, we've made ways to do so available in the episode show notes. If you'd like to connect with us further, support the podcast, or sign up for show updates, just go to withouthatingit.com to get started. And don't forget to subscribe to Ministry Without Hating It wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss our future episode releases. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.